Welcome to Forgotten Ties. We are the guardians of secrets that have been locked away, the voices for stories buried under the weight of time and deceit. We believe that every family has a hidden chapter, a story that was never meant to be told. But here we find them. We pull them into the light, because the truth, no matter how devastating, always has a right to be heard. Thomas Vance was a man who believed in structure. At 45, he was a moderately successful architect, a man who found comfort in blueprints, in right angles, and in the predictable, solid logic of buildings that had stood the test of time. His own life was a reflection of this precision. He lived in a minimalist apartment in downtown Chicago, a space of polished concrete, gray tones, and immaculate surfaces. He was respected by his colleagues, and he was, by all measures, alone. He had never married. He had no children. He was an only child, devoted to his elderly mother, Evelyn, who resided in a nearby assisted living facility. But beneath the sterile, controlled existence, Thomas carried something he could never articulate. It wasn't loneliness. It was an absence, a hollow feeling he'd had since childhood, a sensation akin to a phantom limb, but for the soul. He'd mentioned it once to a therapist, who had diagnosed it as existential melancholy. Thomas simply called it the quiet, a constant, humming void in the background of his life. The decision to use a genealogy website was not driven by this feeling. It was entirely practical. His father had passed away suddenly from a coronary event decades ago, and Thomas's own doctor had recently stressed the importance of a complete family medical history. His mother, Evelyn, now frail and in her late 70s, was becoming hazy on the details of her side of the family. So Thomas ordered the kit. He spat into the small plastic tube, sealed it in the biohazard bag, and mailed it off, giving it no more thought than he would a utility bill. 6 weeks passed. An email appeared in his inbox, its subject line mundane. Your DNA results are ready. He clicked the link with mild, detached curiosity. He expected to see a pie chart of his ancestry, perhaps confirming the Irish and German roots his mother spoke of. He scrolled past the health reports, and then he reached the section marked DNA relatives. His heart, usually so steady, gave a strange, painful lurch. At the very top, under close family, was a name he expected, Evelyn Vance, mother. But directly beneath it, with an identical genetic marker, was a name that made no sense. Daniel. Relationship. Identical twin. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face. The air in his pristine apartment suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Identical twin. The words were an absurdity, a catastrophic glitch in the system. He was an only child. He knew he was an only child. His entire identity, his solitary nature, his whole life was built on this singular, concrete fact. This was impossible. He clicked on the profile. There was no photo, just the name Daniel and the age, 45. The match was absolute, 100% shared DNA. The quiet that Thomas had lived with his entire life was suddenly no longer quiet. It was a roar, a screaming, deafening siren in his skull. A twin. He had a twin. A twin his gentle, frail mother had never mentioned. The implications were monstrous. Was he stolen? Was Daniel stolen? The precise, orderly world of Thomas Vance didn't just crack. It shattered into a million pieces. He grabbed his keys, his hands shaking so violently he could barely fit the key in the lock. He drove to the nursing home in a fog of disbelief and a rising, cold terror. Evelyn was sitting by the window in her room, watching the autumn leaves fall. She smiled when she saw him. Thomas, what a nice surprise. His voice came out as a strained, foreign croak. He couldn't ease into it. He couldn't be gentle. He held out his phone, the screen glowing with the impossible truth. Mom, he said, his voice trembling with a lifetime of unfelt rage. Who is Daniel? Evelyn's gaze shifted to the phone. For a brief second, she seemed merely confused. Then, a change occurred. It was not the gentle confusion of old age. It was a visceral, primal terror. Her paper-thin hand flew to her mouth, and her eyes, suddenly sharp and lucid, filled with a horror that mirrored his own. She didn't speak. She just began to weep. It was not the soft cry of an elderly woman. It was a desperate, gasping sob, a sound torn from the deepest, darkest foundations of her life. And in that horrifying, gut-wrenching sound, Thomas found his answer. It wasn't a glitch. It was a secret she had buried for 45 years. The small, antiseptic-smelling room at the nursing home felt like it was closing in. The walls seemed to be vibrating with the force of Evelyn's breakdown. Her sobs eventually quieted into ragged, painful breaths. She wouldn't look at Thomas. She just stared at her gnarled hands, twisting the thin blanket in her lap. "We were so young," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp that cracked the silence. "Your father, Robert, he was struggling. He'd just lost his job at the steel mill. We had nothing, Thomas. Less than nothing. We were terrified." Thomas stood rigid, his heart a block of ice. "Tell me," he commanded, the forced, icy calm in his voice more terrifying than any shout could have been. Evelyn flinched. She began to speak, the story tumbling out in broken pieces, a confession held back for nearly half a century. The birth had been chaotic, 7 weeks premature. They were told 2 boys had been born, Thomas and Daniel. But Daniel, the doctor had said, was weak, so incredibly weak. He was so small, Thomas, so fragile. She wept, rocking back and forth. The doctor, Dr. Albright, he was an older man, very respected. He took your father aside. He said Daniel wouldn't make it through the night. He said his lungs, they weren't developed. He told us it would be kinder not to see him, to remember you, the healthy one. He said he would take care of the arrangements. Thomas felt his knees buckle. So he died? You let him die alone? No, Evelyn cried, a sudden, desperate fierceness in her voice. The doctor came back the next day. He said Daniel was still fighting, a little fighter, but that he would need special care, surgeries, machines, care we couldn't possibly afford. He said it would bankrupt us. He knew of a facility, a state home upstate for children with severe medical needs. He said they could make him comfortable there. He said it was the only way. The story was convoluted, suffocating in its desperation. They signed the papers, relinquishment papers. They signed away their sickly child, telling themselves it was to save him the pain, and to save themselves from a financial ruin that would destroy the one healthy child they had left. Albright told us he passed away 2 weeks later at the facility. Evelyn concluded, her voice dissolving into a pathetic mumble. We never told anyone. Not our families, no one. It was our secret, our great shame. We agreed. We agreed to pour all our love into you, Thomas. We agreed to forget. Forget. They forgot a child. They erased his brother. They erased him. Thomas left the nursing home, the scent of lavender and lies clinging to his clothes. He drove, not home, but to a neon-lit diner, the only place open at 3 a.m. He couldn't process his mother's words. A sickly child. A special facility. It all sounded like a flimsy, scripted tragedy. But the DNA match was real. Daniel was alive. He hadn't died 2 weeks later. He had survived. He had grown up. He had spit into a tube just as Thomas had. Thomas opened his laptop, his hands shaking so violently he could barely type. Daniel. The genealogy website didn't provide a last name, but it gave an age, 45, and a possible location based on the test kit's registration. Springfield, Illinois. He started cross-referencing public records, his architect's mind desperately searching for logic in the chaos. Daniel Vance? No results. Daniel Albright? No. He tried searching for the facility. The St. Jude's Home for Children. It didn't exist. Dr. Albright? Dead for 25 years. Thomas felt like he was chasing a ghost. He spent hours, the coffee growing cold and bitter, digging through digitized newspaper archives, social media profiles, anything. Finally, he found a link. a public court record database. He typed in Daniel, age 45, and the county. A list of names appeared, and one made his blood run cold. Daniel Miller. He clicked. The face staring back at him from the grainy, pixelated mugshot was his own. It was his face, but a version that had been dragged through hell. It was his exact facial structure, the same high cheekbones, the same dark eyes. But this face was ravaged. The eyes were hollow, devoid of any light. The skin was sallow, stretched tight over the bone. A jagged, angry scar ran from the man's right temple down to his jawline. The headline above the image read, "Local man sentenced in connection with armed robbery, manslaughter." Thomas read the details, his vision blurring. Daniel Miller, his twin brother. He wasn't in a special facility. He hadn't died. He was inmate number 774-09, currently incarcerated at the Illinois River Correctional Center, serving a 20-year sentence. The sickly child hadn't been cared for. He had been thrown away, and in the vacuum of the life Thomas had been given, the good schools, the university degree, the pristine apartment, Daniel's life had been filled with the unimaginable. Foster homes, juvenile detention, and now prison. The absence Thomas had felt his entire life suddenly had a name. It wasn't the quiet. It was guilt. It was the screaming, silent echo of a stolen, parallel life. For 3 days, Thomas did not go to work. He did not answer his phone. He sat in his perfectly ordered, gray apartment. The mugshot of Daniel Miller burned into his mind's eye. He was frozen, trapped by the grotesque symmetry of it all. While he, Thomas, was learning to draft blueprints for elegant homes, Daniel was learning to survive in the impersonal cruelty of the state foster care system. The PI Thomas hired to expedite the information confirmed it all. Daniel Miller, processed as an abandoned infant, found wrapped in a blanket on the steps of a church just days after Thomas's own birth date. There was no record of a St. Jude's home. He'd been in 12 different foster homes before he aged out of the system at 18. The placements were a catalog of neglect and instability. Petty theft at 16. Aggravated assault at 20. A long, predictable spiral that ended in a botched liquor store robbery where the elderly clerk, terrified, had a fatal heart attack. Manslaughter. Thomas looked at his own clean, manicured hands that designed beautiful spaces, and felt a wave of nausea so profound it brought him to his knees. He was the lucky one, the chosen one, and Daniel was the discard. The sickness his mother spoke of wasn't in Daniel's lungs. It was in the secret. He had to see him. It was a compulsion, a gravitational pull toward the other half of his DNA, toward the man who was his living shadow. He scheduled a visit. The 4-hour drive to the correctional center was a silent scream. What does one say to a ghost? How do you apologize to a man for the crime of your own existence? The visiting room was a low-ceilinged, suffocating space painted a nauseating pale green, smelling of bleach and cold despair. He was led to a booth, a thick pane of safety glass separating him from the world Daniel inhabited. He waited, and then a door buzzed open, and Daniel was brought in, wearing a dull orange jumpsuit that hung off his thin frame. He moved with a slow, heavy gait, his eyes scanning the room with a bored, predatory indifference. Then he saw Thomas, and he stopped dead. The indifference shattered, replaced by a profound, agonizing shock that mirrored what Thomas felt when he first saw the website. It was, Thomas realized with a jolt, the first time Daniel had ever seen his own face, whole and unharmed, looking back at him. Daniel sat down slowly, his movements rigid. He didn't speak. He just stared. He studied Thomas's expensive watch, his cashmere sweater, his neatly trimmed hair. It was like being examined by a version of himself that had been steeped in hatred. Thomas picked up the crackling receiver, his throat painfully dry. My name is Thomas Vance. I got your name from a DNA website. I think we're brothers." Daniel's lip curled into a sneer, but his eyes were wide, frantic. "You think?" His voice was a low gravel, rough from disuse. "I got the same email, city boy. Some public defender digging into my case paid for it. Thought it might help. Family connections. What a joke. Thomas forged ahead, the words tumbling out. My mother, our mother, Evelyn. She told me. She said you were sick, that you were premature, that they put you in a home. Daniel slammed his calloused hand against the glass. A sudden violent crack that made Thomas jump back. Sick? He spat, the word dripping with a lifetime of venom. She told you I was sick? She said your lungs? She said they thought you would die. She lied. Daniel hissed, leaning so close to the glass his breath fogged it. His eyes, Thomas's eyes, were blazing with a terrifying cold fire. They lied. You think I haven't spent my whole life looking? Tracking it down? You think I just popped up in that church? That doctor. Albright. Thomas nodded, stunned into silence. He didn't run a facility, Daniel said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He ran a market. He sold babies, Thomas. He sold inconvenient babies to rich, barren couples. And we, brother, we were inconvenient. Thomas stared, the blood roaring in his ears. Sold? To who? Doesn't matter, Daniel said, sitting back, a look of bitter, painful triumph on his scarred face. They didn't want me. They couldn't handle two. So they made a choice. They kept you, the perfect one, the healthy one. And they sold me, like a damaged appliance, like a piece of meat. No, Thomas whispered, shaking his head. No, she was devastated. She thought you died. She mourned you. Daniel let out a harsh, barking laugh that held zero humor. She mourned me? Is that the bedtime story she told you? Is that what she told herself so she could sleep at night? I found letters, years ago, from the couple who bought me. They wrote to Albright, complaining that I was difficult, that I cried too much. He kept records, that bastard. Meticulous records. Our parents knew. They knew I was alive and they let me go. They erased me. Daniel leaned forward again, his dark, hollow eyes boring into Thomas's. So welcome to the family, brother. You got the house, the education, and the clean hands. I got this. And now you get to live with knowing it. Thomas left the prison a shattered man. He stumbled back to his car, the fluorescent glare of the parking lot feeling like an accusation. Daniel's words, he ran a market, were a cancer that had metastasized, poisoning every memory Thomas had. He couldn't trust Evelyn's story of a frail, dying baby. He couldn't trust Daniel's venomous narrative of a cold, calculated sale. The truth had to be somewhere in the agonizing gray middle. The private investigator paid a significant sum, dug deeper, this time focusing not on Daniel, but on the deceased Dr. Albright. Took 2 weeks. The investigator didn't find letters. He found something better. A storage locker. A locker belonging to Albright's defunct practice, unpaid for decades, and finally auctioned off as abandoned property. The buyer had kept the contents, boxes upon boxes of private medical records, ledgers, and journals. And in one of those boxes, a file. Vance. Baby B. Daniel. Thomas sat in his car, the engine off, the photocopied file on his lap, unable to breathe. He read the brittle, yellowed pages under the dome light. Daniel was right. Albright had run an illegal adoption ring. He specialized in problem births, twins, children of unwed mothers, infants with minor, correctable defects. He would terrify the vulnerable parents with stories of massive medical bills or imminent death, convince them to sign away their rights to a special facility, and then sell the infants to wealthy, desperate couples on his private list. But Daniel was also wrong. The file contained Albright's private, handwritten notes from his meetings with Evelyn and Robert Vance. The father, Robert, had been overwhelmed. He had wanted to give Daniel up, seeing him only as a burden that would sink them all. But Evelyn had refused. The notes detailed her arguments, her pleas. She had visited Daniel in the nursery for 3 days, refusing to sign. But then the pressure mounted. Her husband's despair, his threats to leave, the doctor's relentless clinical talk of mounting bills, of Daniel's poor quality of life, of the opportunity the child would have elsewhere. Finally, she broke. She signed the papers, believing the sickly story, agreeing to send him to the state home. It was the doctor who intercepted the state transfer. He falsified the records, reported baby B as deceased to the state, and then sold Daniel to the couple Daniel had tracked years later. Evelyn and Robert Vance genuinely believed Daniel had been transferred to a state facility and had passed away. They had mourned. They had lived with that toxic shame. Thomas felt a sliver of relief until he reached the last document at the bottom of the file. It was a receipt, a carbon copy of a bank transfer, a transfer to Evelyn Vance for the sum of $500, dated 2 weeks after Daniel was transferred. It wasn't listed as a payment. It was listed as a grief and hardship grant from a non-existent charitable fund. It was hush money. It was the price of her silence. He drove back to the nursing home, the paper heavy as a tombstone in his hand. He found Evelyn in the common room watching a game show. "He didn't die," Thomas said, his voice flat, dead. "And he wasn't just given to the state." Evelyn looked up, her eyes wide with a confusion that was all too real. Thomas laid the copy of the bank transfer receipt on her lap. $500, Mom, from Dr. Albright, 2 weeks after he was gone. Why? Evelyn looked at the paper. Her face crumpled, not in the terror of being caught, but in a shame so profound, so ancient, it seemed to hollow her out from the inside. She stammered, her hands shaking. He said it was to help. For the funeral costs we would have had. For you. For your crib. We were so poor, Thomas. I didn't. You knew, Thomas whispered, the final, devastating realization hitting him like a physical blow. You knew it wasn't right. You knew he wasn't just gone. You took the money. I didn't know he was sold, she pleaded, grabbing his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. I swear to you, Thomas, I believed he went to that home. I believed he was sick. The money was... I was scared. Your father was talking about leaving. I took the money to keep you safe, to buy your crib. And there it was, the devastating, selfish, terrified, human truth. She hadn't sold her son, but she had accepted payment for his absence. In her moment of ultimate weakness, she had chosen one son over the other, not out of malice, but out of a desperate, terrified instinct for survival. Thomas Vance never returned to his gray, orderly apartment. He sold it along with his architecture firm. The precision of his old life felt like a grotesque mockery. He now spends his time, and his considerable fortune, funding Daniel's legal appeals. The connection is frayed, poisoned by 45 years of resentment and guilt. Daniel sees Thomas not as a brother, but as the symbol of everything that was stolen from him. And Thomas sees Daniel as a living monument to his mother's most terrible human compromise. The discovery on that family tree website didn't just give Thomas a brother. It erased his entire past. It replaced his identity with a single agonizing question. Who was he, if not the chosen one? And what value does a life have when it is built upon the ashes of another? The ties that bind us are sometimes not ties of love, but of secrets. And for Thomas and Daniel, those ties are a chain. Thank you for joining us on Forgotten Ties. If you were moved by this story, if you've ever felt the pull of the unknown in your own family tree, please do us a favor and press that like button. It truly helps the channel, and it lets us know that we are reaching you. Subscribe to Forgotten Ties, and make sure to hit that notification bell. You never know when the next shadow from the past will be brought into the light.